Charlotte Bennett stood perfectly still in the grand hall of the Zathrian Imperial Palace. Her uniform was clean and pressed even though she had been working for 16 hours straight. She was the commander of the human security team that protected Ambassador Patricia Morrison. The palace walls glowed with a soft blue light that came from living panels built into the obsidian floors. Charlotte had spent 3 years learning about the Zathrian Empire and its strange customs, but nothing had prepared her for what was about to happen in the next few seconds. The Zathrians were elegant creatures with skin you could almost see through. Their blood glowed softly beneath their skin as it moved through their bodies. They were tall and graceful, and they had rules for everything. Every movement had meaning, and every gesture carried weight in their society. Queen Consort Velshara was one of the most powerful Zathrians in the Empire because she was married to Emperor Kethran. Everyone respected her and everyone feared her just a little bit. Velshara entered the reception hall that morning wearing robes made of crystal that chimed softly with each step she took. The sound was beautiful and somewhat haunting. Charlotte watched her approach from her position near the wall where all security personnel were supposed to stand. She had learned to read the small signs that meant trouble was coming. The way someone walked, or the tone of their voice, or the color that flashed across Zathrian skin when emotions ran high. Right now, she was seeing all the signs that something bad was about to happen. There was a young Zathrian guard standing near the ceremonial archway. His name was Corvel, and he was new to this job. He had only finished his training a few weeks ago, and this was his first assignment in the diplomatic wing of the palace. It was supposed to be an easy job that would help him learn the basics. Instead, he had made a terrible mistake. He was standing in the wrong place. The archway he was blocking was the traditional path that the Queen Consort always used when she walked through this hall. It was a small mistake, but in Zathrian culture, small mistakes could have big consequences. Charlotte saw the Queen Consort stop walking. Velshara's skin began to change color from its normal amber shade to a dark red that meant anger. The young guard realized his mistake too late. His own skin started flickering between purple and gray, which Charlotte had learned meant he was feeling afraid and ashamed at the same time. Corvel tried to move out of the way, but he was frozen by fear. Everyone in the hall stopped what they were doing and turned to watch. The Queen Consort raised her hand. Her palm was open and aimed directly at the guard's face. She was going to slap him in front of everyone. In Zathrian culture, this kind of physical punishment was normal and expected when someone made a mistake. It was how they maintained order and discipline in their society. But Charlotte knew something that most of the Zathrians in that room did not know. There were new treaties that the Empire had signed with the Galactic Council. Those treaties said that physical punishment of workers was not allowed when diplomatic observers were present. Breaking those treaties would cause serious political problems. Time seemed to slow down the way it always did when Charlotte's training took over. She had spent years studying how to handle dangerous situations. She had learned when to act and when to wait. She had learned how to read people and predict what they would do next. Right now, every instinct she had was screaming at her to move. If the Queen Consort struck that guard, it would violate the treaty. Representatives from 4 different alien species were in this palace right now, attending the same cultural exchange program as the human delegation. They would see the violation and they would have to report it. The consequences would be severe. Charlotte moved without thinking about it. Her hand shot out and caught the Queen Consort's wrist in mid-swing. She used just enough force to stop the motion, but not enough to hurt. The hall went completely silent. Every single Zathrian in the room turned to stare at Charlotte. Their skin began changing colors in waves of shock and disbelief. What Charlotte had just done was unthinkable in their culture. Touching royalty without permission was a crime that could be punished by death. Charlotte held the Queen Consort's wrist for just a moment, and then released it. She stepped back and put her hands at her sides to show she meant no threat. Her heart was pounding, but her face remained calm. She had been trained to stay cool under pressure, and right now she needed every bit of that training. The Queen Consort's eyes had changed from amber to a dangerous crimson red. Around the hall, palace guards were reaching for their weapons. Those weapons were made of living crystal that could cut through steel like butter. Charlotte spoke in perfect Zathrian language. She had a small computer chip implanted in her brain that helped her speak and understand alien languages. But the chip could only do so much. Charlotte had spent 3 years studying not just the words but the proper way to use them. She knew which tone to use when speaking to royalty. She knew which phrases showed respect and which ones would be taken as insults. Right now, she was using the most formal and respectful tone possible. "Your Radiance, I humbly request permission to speak." Charlotte kept her eyes locked on the Queen Consort's eyes. In most human cultures, staring at someone could be seen as rude or aggressive. But in Zathrian culture, eye contact meant both respect and strength. Looking away would have been seen as weakness or dishonesty. Charlotte was walking a very thin line between showing proper respect and appearing weak. One wrong word or gesture could get her killed. The Queen Consort's skin rippled with different colors as emotions warred inside her. Anger was fighting with curiosity. She was furious that a human had dared to touch her, but she was also interested in what Charlotte might say. Finally, Velshara spoke, and her voice was cold and sharp. "You dare lay hands upon my person, human. You understand this is grounds for immediate execution." It was not really a question, but Charlotte answered anyway. "I understand, Your Radiance." Charlotte kept her voice steady and calm. "I also understand that striking this guard would have violated 3 separate treaties your empire signed with the Galactic Council last year. Section 47C specifically prohibits physical punishment of junior personnel in the presence of diplomatic observers." She let that information hang in the air. She could see the calculation beginning in the Queen Consort's eyes. The Zathrian Empire had fought for centuries to get a seat on the Galactic Council. Those treaties represented decades of negotiation and compromise. Ambassador Morrison stepped forward from where she had been standing. Patricia Morrison was 57 years old, and she had handled more diplomatic crises than most politicians would see in 3 lifetimes. Her silver hair was pulled back tight and her dark eyes missed nothing. "Your Radiance," Morrison said in a voice that carried authority. "Commander Bennett acted to protect not just that young guard, but your own position. A treaty violation witnessed by representatives from 4 different species currently in this palace would have created considerable difficulties." The ambassador let her words sink in, while everyone in the hall processed what had just happened and what it might mean for the silence in the hall stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only a few seconds. Charlotte could feel her heart beating hard in her chest, but she kept her breathing slow and steady. She was still holding the Queen Consort's gaze, and she could see the wheels turning behind those crimson eyes. Velshara was thinking about what Charlotte had said about the treaties and the political consequences. Around them, the other Zathrians were standing frozen like statues. Their skin colors were shifting in waves that showed confusion and shock. The palace guards had their hands on their weapons, but they had not drawn them yet. They were waiting for orders from the Queen Consort. Charlotte knew that if Velshara gave the command, they would attack without hesitation. These guards were trained from childhood to obey without question. They would kill Charlotte in seconds, and there would be nothing anyone could do to stop them. But Charlotte also knew that Velshara was smart. The Queen Consort had not risen to her position by making rash decisions. Velshara's skin slowly began to shift from crimson back toward its normal amber color. The change was gradual, like watching the sun set over the horizon. It meant she was regaining control of her emotions and thinking more clearly. Charlotte allowed herself to take a slightly deeper breath, but she did not relax her posture. She was not out of danger yet, and she knew it. One wrong move could still end in disaster. The Queen Consort spoke again, and this time her voice was more controlled. "Explain yourself, Commander Bennett. Tell me why I should not order your execution for laying hands on my person." It was a direct challenge, but it was also an invitation. Velshara was giving Charlotte a chance to defend her actions. That was a good sign. It meant the Queen Consort was willing to listen, at least for now. Charlotte took a breath and began to speak. She chose her words carefully because every syllable mattered. "Your Radiance, I acted to protect your interests and the interests of the Zathrian Empire. At this moment, there are 3 members of the Galactic Council Trade Review Committee present in this palace. They are attending the Cultural Exchange Program, along with our delegation. One of them is Ambassador Thelkor of the Vryn Confederacy. He was standing directly behind you when this incident began." She saw the Queen Consort's eyes widen slightly. The Vryn Confederacy was powerful in the council, and their opinions carried a lot of weight. Charlotte continued. "The Vryn have made their position very clear. They will not support expanded trade rights for any empire that violates council labor protection treaties. Section 47C was written specifically to prevent physical punishment of subordinates in work environments. This palace during diplomatic functions qualifies as such an environment." Charlotte gestured toward the young guard Corvel, who was still standing frozen at his post. His skin had turned completely gray, which meant he was experiencing extreme shame and fear. This guard made a mistake. It was a small protocol error that could be corrected with a verbal reprimand. If your radiance had struck him, Ambassador Thelcor would have been required to file a violation report. The review committee would then be forced to delay or deny the trade expansion request. Charlotte paused to let that sink in before delivering the final piece of information. Based on current economic projections, the trade expansion would bring approximately 17 billion credits in annual revenue to the Zathrian Empire. The number hung in the air like a physical object. 17 billion credits was a staggering amount of money even for an empire as wealthy as Zathria. Charlotte could see other Zathrian officials in the hall beginning to do the math in their heads. Their skin colors started shifting as they realized the magnitude of what had almost happened. Ambassador Morrison stepped closer to the Queen Consort. She moved slowly and carefully to show she meant no threat. "Your Radiance," Morrison said in her calm, diplomatic voice. "Commander Bennett has studied your culture extensively for 3 years. She understands that discipline and hierarchy are fundamental to Zathrian society. Her intervention was not meant as an insult or a challenge to your authority. She acted to preserve your political standing and protect the Empire's economic interests." The Queen Consort stood silent for a long moment. Her skin went through a complex series of color changes that Charlotte had never seen before. It was like watching emotions play across her face but written in light instead of expressions. The other Zathrians in the hall were watching their Queen Consort closely. They were waiting to see what she would do next. This was a critical moment that could change everything. Finally, Velshara spoke, and there was something new in her voice. It was not quite respect, but it was close. "You are either remarkably clever, Commander, or remarkably fortunate. Perhaps you are both." She turned her attention to the young guard who had caused all this trouble. "Corval, you have brought shame to your family and endangered your empire's interests through carelessness and poor attention to protocol." The young guard's skin flickered even darker, if that was possible. He looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The Queen Consort continued. "You will report to the training master immediately for remedial instruction in diplomatic protocol. You will spend the next 30 days learning proper procedures until they are burned into your memory. You are dismissed from this hall." Corval bowed so low that his forehead nearly touched the polished floor. Then he turned and left the hall as quickly as dignity would allow. Charlotte watched him go. She noticed how the other guards deliberately looked away as he passed. It was their way of showing disapproval without saying anything. In Zathrian culture, being ignored was almost as bad as being punished. Corval would carry the shame of this incident for a long time, but at least he was alive and he still had his position. That was better than what could have happened. The Queen Consort turned back to Charlotte, and now her expression was calculating. There was an intelligence in her eyes that suggested she was seeing Charlotte in a new light. "Commander Bennett, walk with me. Alone." It was not a request, but a command. Charlotte felt her stomach tighten slightly. Being alone with the Queen Consort could be dangerous, but refusing would be worse. Charlotte looked at Ambassador Morrison, who gave a small nod. Permission granted. Charlotte fell into step beside the Queen Consort, and they began walking toward one of the side corridors. Behind them, Charlotte could hear the soft footsteps of royal guards following at a distance. They were never truly alone in the palace. There were always guards and always watchers. But this was as private as a conversation could get in this place. They walked through corridors that became progressively quieter and more private. The public areas with their elaborate decorations gave way to simpler passages. The walls here were lined with living plants that gave off a soft, natural glow. It was gentler than the artificial lights in the main halls. Charlotte kept pace with the Queen Consort, matching her stride for stride. She was aware of every sound and every shadow. Her training never truly switched off. Finally, they emerged into a small garden that was open to the sky above, but surrounded by walls that ensured privacy. The plants here were different from anything Charlotte had seen on Earth. They moved slightly even though there was no wind. Their leaves caught the light and reflected it in strange patterns. It was beautiful in an alien way. The Queen Consort stopped in the center of the garden and turned to face Charlotte. Now they would have the real conversation about what had happened in the hall and what it meant for the future. The Queen Consort stood in the center of the private garden, looking at Charlotte with an expression that was difficult to read. The anger had faded from her skin completely, now leaving behind the natural amber glow, but there was something else in her eyes. Something that might have been curiosity or possibly calculation. Charlotte remained at attention, waiting for the queen consort to speak first. In Zathrian culture, the person of higher rank always initiated private conversations. Do you know why I brought you here, human? Velshara's voice had lost some of its formal edge, though she still maintained her royal bearing. The question was not really hostile, but it was not friendly either. It was the voice of someone trying to figure out a puzzle. Charlotte considered her response carefully. Every word mattered in a conversation like this. I assume your Radiance wishes to discuss the incident away from other observers. Charlotte kept her tone respectful and neutral. She was not trying to be clever or impress the queen consort. She was simply stating what seemed obvious. But Velshara shook her head slightly. The gesture was small, but it meant something in Zathrian body language. Clever, but not entirely accurate. The queen consort walked to a bench made from living crystal. The material grew from the ground like a plant, but it was hard as stone. She sat down and the bench seemed to mold itself to her body. She did not invite Charlotte to sit, which was a deliberate choice. It maintained the power difference between them. I brought you here because I am curious. Your species has been part of the galactic community for barely 3 decades, yet you navigated a situation that could have destroyed years of diplomatic work. It was a direct question, and it deserved an honest answer. Charlotte took a moment to organize her thoughts. This was an opportunity, but it was also a test. The queen consort was evaluating her, measuring her worth. May I speak freely, Your Radiance? Charlotte asked. It was important to ask permission before saying anything that might be taken as criticism or presumption. Velshara gestured for her to continue. The gesture was permission and command at the same time. Charlotte took a breath and began to explain. Humanity has been dealing with different cultures and different ways of organizing society for our entire history. We have had thousands of different governments and philosophies on one small planet. Some valued individual freedom above everything else. Others believed the group was more important than any single person. We have had democracies and dictatorships. We have had kings and elected presidents and military councils and religious leaders. The queen consort's skin flickered with interest. That sounds chaotic. How do you function as a species? Charlotte allowed herself a small smile. With difficulty, Your Radiance. We have had terrible wars that killed millions of people. We have made horrible mistakes. We have conquered and been conquered. We have destroyed and rebuilt. But through all of that, we learned something important. We learned that understanding those who are different from us is essential for survival. She gestured to the garden around them. Your empire is remarkable in its unity. One government, one philosophy, one way of doing things that has worked for thousands of years. That unity has made you strong. But it also means you have less experience in dealing with radically different viewpoints. Humans have been forced to become experts in understanding other cultures because we had no choice. Our planet was too small to avoid each other. Charlotte paused to let that information settle. She was walking a fine line between explaining and insulting. She needed the queen consort to understand without feeling like Charlotte was saying humans were better. When we finally reached the stars and discovered we were not alone in the universe, we already had thousands of years of practice in cultural translation. We knew how to observe and adapt and find common ground, even with those who seemed completely alien to us. Velshara was silent for a long moment. Her skin shifted through several shades of blue and green, which Charlotte had learned meant she was thinking deeply. The queen consort's eyes never left Charlotte's face. She was analyzing every word, every gesture, every tiny detail. Finally she spoke, and her voice carried something that might have been respect. You are suggesting that your species' divided nature is actually an advantage in galactic politics, not an advantage, Your Radiance, Charlotte corrected gently. An adaptation. We are not better than the Zathrian Empire. We are simply different. We have different strengths and different weaknesses. Sometimes those differences can be valuable when working together. The queen consort nodded slowly. It was a small gesture, but it meant she was considering Charlotte's words seriously. Tell me about your training, Commander Bennett. The queen consort changed the subject slightly. How does a human become skilled at reading alien cultures? Charlotte thought about all the years she had spent studying, the endless classes and simulations and real-world practice. It was not something that could be explained quickly, but she tried. I spent 4 years at the Diplomatic Academy on Earth learning the basics of xenopsychology and cultural analysis. Then I spent 2 years working with the Martian colonies which have their own distinct culture, separate from Earth. After that, I was assigned to the embassy on Station 7, where I encountered 12 different alien species. I learned their languages and customs. I studied how they thought and what they valued. I made mistakes and learned from them. 3 years ago, I requested assignment to study Zathrian culture specifically. Why? The Queen Consort's question was simple, but it carried weight. Why would you dedicate 3 years of your life to studying my people? Charlotte met her gaze directly. Because the Zathrian Empire is one of the most important powers in this sector of space. Because understanding your culture could prevent conflicts and build bridges. Because I believed it was worth the effort. Velshara's skin rippled with colors that Charlotte could not quite interpret. The Queen Consort stood up from the bench and walked to the edge of the garden. She looked out over the city that spread below the palace. The capital was vast and ancient, with buildings that had stood for thousands of years. It was a testament to Zathrian endurance and planning. I was prepared to have you executed, Commander Bennett. Velshara said the words without turning around. When you grabbed my wrist, I was genuinely prepared to call for your death. Do you understand how close you came to dying? Charlotte felt a chill run through her body, but she kept her voice steady. I understood the risk, your radiance. I made a decision that the potential consequences of allowing the strike outweighed the personal risk to myself. And if you had been wrong. The Queen Consort turned to face her. If I had decided that preserving my dignity was worth the economic cost? If I had ordered your execution anyway? What then? Charlotte took a breath before answering. Then I would have died, your radiance. But Ambassador Morrison would have filed a report. The Galactic Council would have been notified. The treaty violation would have been recorded regardless of what happened to me. My death would not have changed the political reality. The Queen Consort's skin shifted to a color that Charlotte recognized as respect, mixed with something else. Perhaps admiration, or perhaps just acknowledgement of courage. You are a remarkable individual, Commander Bennett. The Zathrian Empire has much to learn from your species. That statement hung in the air between them, full of possibilities and implications for what might come next in the relationship between their two peoples. The next 3 days were a blur of meetings and negotiations. Charlotte found herself sitting in conference rooms with Ambassador Morrison and various Zathrian officials as they hammered out the details of what would become the Cultural Exchange Initiative. The name had been chosen carefully to sound cooperative rather than instructional. Nobody wanted the Zathrians to feel like they were being told their culture was wrong. That would doom the entire project before it started. Ambassador Morrison proved to be exactly the right person to handle the human side of the negotiations. She understood the political sensitivities involved and knew how to phrase things in ways that would be acceptable to both governments. Charlotte watched her work with growing admiration. This was diplomacy at the highest level. Every word was chosen for maximum effect. Every gesture carried meaning. The Zathrian negotiators were led by Minister Torvin, who was responsible for foreign affairs in the Empire. He was older than the Queen Consort, and his skin had taken on a slightly darker amber hue that came with age. He was cautious and conservative, but he was also pragmatic. He understood that the Empire needed to adapt to survive in the modern galaxy, but he insisted that any adaptation must respect Zathrian traditions and sovereignty. One of the biggest challenges was defining the scope of the program. The Zathrians wanted human advisors to help with diplomatic training, but they did not want humans involved in internal political matters. That was a reasonable boundary, and Charlotte agreed with it completely. The last thing humanity needed was to be seen as interfering in Zathrian domestic affairs. That would create resentment and undermine the entire purpose of the program. Another challenge was selecting the human participants. They would need people with specific skills and temperaments. Cultural sensitivity was essential, but so was the ability to teach and communicate effectively. They would need people who could handle the stress of living in an alien culture for extended periods. And most importantly, they would need people who genuinely respected the Zathrians and wanted to help them succeed. Charlotte spent hours reviewing candidate files that were sent from Earth. There were anthropologists who specialized in alien cultures. There were diplomats with years of experience in cross-cultural negotiations. There were military officers trained in cultural awareness. There were teachers and psychologists and historians. Each one brought different strengths to the table. The challenge was finding the right combination of people who would work well together and with their Zathrian counterparts while the official negotiations continued. Charlotte found herself spending time with various Zathrian officials in more informal settings. She was invited to dinners and garden parties. She was asked to give presentations about human culture and history. She realized that the Zathrians were evaluating her just as carefully as she was evaluating potential program participants. They wanted to know if humans could truly be trusted with this level of access to their society. One evening, Charlotte was invited to a private dinner with the Queen Consort and several high-ranking ministers. The dinner was held in a smaller dining hall that was beautifully decorated with living plants and soft lighting. The food was interesting, though Charlotte still had not gotten used to some of the textures common in Zathrian cuisine. Everything had a slightly crystalline quality that crunched in unexpected ways. During the dinner, Minister Torvan asked Charlotte a direct question. "Commander Bennett, why should we trust your species with this program? You have been in space for less than 50 years. What makes you think you have anything to teach a civilization as old as ours?" It was a fair question, and Charlotte had been expecting something like it. She put down her utensil and considered her answer carefully. "Minister Torvan, I do not think humans have more wisdom than Zathrians, simply because we are better at cultural adaptation." Charlotte spoke slowly and clearly. "We have this skill not because we are superior, but because we had to develop it to survive. Earth is a planet of conflicts and contradictions. We spent thousands of years learning to navigate differences or die trying. Your civilization had the advantage of unity, and that allowed you to achieve things we could never accomplish. But our disadvantage forced us to develop different skills." She leaned forward slightly. "This program is not about humans teaching Zathrians to be more like humans. It is about sharing techniques for understanding and working with cultures that are different from your own. You will still be Zathrians with your own values and traditions. We are simply offering tools that might help you navigate the increasingly complex galactic political landscape." The minister's skin shifted through several colors as he processed her words. The Queen Consort spoke up from her position at the head of the table. "Minister Torvan, I watched Commander Bennett prevent a diplomatic disaster through quick thinking and cultural awareness. She understood the political implications of a simple action better than any of us in that hall. That is the kind of thinking we need to cultivate in our own people, not to replace our culture, but to enhance our effectiveness in dealing with others." Another minister, whose name Charlotte had not quite caught, asked about the practical details. How long would human advisors stay in the Empire? Where would they be housed? What access would they have to sensitive information? These were reasonable security concerns, and Charlotte and Ambassador Morrison had anticipated most of them. Morrison explained that advisors would serve rotating terms of 6 months to 1 year. They would live in designated quarters within the diplomatic complex, and they would only have access to information directly relevant to their teaching responsibilities. The dinner continued for several hours with questions and discussions ranging across many topics. Charlotte found herself answering questions about everything from human military organization to Earth's environmental problems to the way different human cultures celebrated important life events. The Zathrians were genuinely curious about humanity, and that curiosity gave Charlotte hope. People who were curious were people who wanted to learn. Late that night, Charlotte returned to her quarters in the human delegation wing. She was exhausted but also energized. The program was taking shape. It was becoming real. She sat at her desk and began writing a report to send back to Earth. Her superiors needed to understand not just what was being proposed, but why it mattered. This was not just another diplomatic initiative. This was a chance to build something meaningful between two very different species. As she wrote, Charlotte thought about young Corvell, the guard whose mistake had started everything. She had heard that he had volunteered to be part of the program. He wanted to be among the first Zathrians to study with human advisors. His failure had become his motivation to learn. There was something hopeful in that. Maybe mistakes did not have to be the end of something. Maybe they could be the beginning of something better. Charlotte finished her report and sent it through the secure communication channel. Then she allowed herself a moment to simply sit and think. A week ago, she had been a security commander doing her job. Now she was potentially about to become the director of a program that could change the relationship between humanity and the Zathrian Empire. Life had a way of surprising you when you least expected it. 2 months passed in a flurry of preparations and planning. The Cultural Exchange Initiative had been officially approved by both governments. though not without significant debate on both sides. On Earth, there had been concerns about whether humans should be interfering in alien cultural development. Some politicians worried it would create dependency or resentment. Others worried about the safety of human personnel living in such an alien environment for extended periods. Within the Zathrian Empire, the resistance had been even stronger. Conservative factions argued that accepting instruction from a younger species was humiliating. They said it undermined Zathrian dignity and suggested weakness. But the Queen Consort and her allies had prevailed by framing the program as a strategic investment in the Empire's future rather than an admission of inadequacy. They emphasized that learning new skills did not mean abandoning old values. Charlotte had indeed been appointed as Director of Human Zathrian Cultural Relations. It was a newly created position that gave her authority over the entire program from the human side. She would work alongside a Zathrian counterpart named Valkyra, who was a senior official in the diplomatic service. Valkyra was younger than Charlotte had expected, with bright amber skin that suggested she was in her prime years. She was intelligent and direct, and she had a reputation for getting things done. The first meeting between Charlotte and Valkyra took place in a newly renovated wing of the Imperial Palace. The space had been designated as the headquarters for the Cultural Exchange Initiative. It included classrooms and meeting rooms and living quarters for the human advisors. The decorations were a blend of human and Zathrian aesthetics, neutral colors and simple lines that would be comfortable for both species. Valkyra greeted Charlotte with the formal gesture of respect that was customary in Zathrian culture. Her skin remained a steady amber, which meant she was calm and professional. Director Bennett, I look forward to working with you on this initiative. I have reviewed your file and I am impressed by your qualifications. Charlotte returned the gesture and responded in Zathrian. Director Valkyra, the honor is mine. I hope we can build something valuable together. They spent the first hour discussing logistics and schedules. The first group of human advisors would arrive in 3 weeks. There would be 12 of them initially. 6 would focus on diplomatic training. 3 would work on cultural analysis and communication. 2 would handle administrative and support functions. And 1 would be a medical specialist who understood both human and Zathrian physiology in case of health emergencies. The Zathrian participants in the program numbered 24. They were diplomats and government officials who had volunteered or been selected based on their potential to benefit from the training. Young Corvell was among them. Charlotte had reviewed his file personally. Despite his embarrassing mistake in the hall, he had excellent scores in his other training, and his superiors believed he had real potential. His eagerness to learn from his error was seen as a positive trait. As Charlotte and Valkyra discussed the curriculum they would use, Charlotte was struck by how different their perspectives were on some basic concepts. For example, when Charlotte talked about teaching flexible response to unexpected situations, Valkyra initially interpreted that as abandoning proper protocol. It took careful explanation for Charlotte to convey that flexibility did not mean chaos. It meant having multiple tools available and knowing which one to use in different contexts. This is going to be more challenging than I thought, Charlotte said honestly. We are not just teaching skills. We are bridging fundamentally different ways of thinking about order and adaptation. Valkyra's skin flickered with what Charlotte had learned was thoughtful consideration. Yes, but that is also what makes it worthwhile. If it were easy, the Zathrian Empire would have figured it out on our own. We need this challenge. Over the following weeks, Charlotte worked closely with Valkyra to finalize every detail of the program. They developed a careful balance between structured lessons and practical exercises. The human advisors would not lecture Zathrian diplomats like students in a classroom. Instead, they would work alongside them. They would analyze real diplomatic scenarios together. They would discuss different approaches and their potential outcomes. They would learn from each other. Charlotte also spent time getting to know the physical space where the program would operate. She walked through the classrooms and touched the walls. She looked out the windows at the city below. She tried to imagine what it would be like for the human advisors living here so far from home. She wanted to make sure they would have what they needed not just professionally, but personally. Being isolated in an alien culture could be difficult even for people trained for it. One afternoon, the Queen Consort visited the new facility. She walked through the rooms with Charlotte and Valkyra, examining everything closely. When they reached the main classroom, Valkyra stopped and looked around. This is where it begins, she said softly. This is where we start learning to see the galaxy through different eyes. Charlotte felt the weight of that statement. The Queen Consort was right. This was about more than just diplomatic training. It was about opening minds, Your Radiance, Charlotte said. I want to be honest about something. This program will not produce instant results. Learning to think in new ways takes time. There will be failures and frustrations. Some people will resist the training. Some lessons will not work as planned. We will need patience and commitment to see this through. The Queen Consort's skin shifted to a calm blue. I understand, Director Bennett. I did not enter into this expecting miracles. I entered into it expecting hard work and gradual progress. That is enough. As the arrival date for the human advisors approached, Charlotte found herself feeling increasingly nervous. She had recruited these people personally. She had convinced them to leave their lives on Earth and come to this alien world. She felt responsible for their success and their safety. What if she had made the wrong choices? What if the program failed because she had not prepared adequately? Ambassador Morrison noticed her anxiety and pulled her aside one morning. Charlotte, you have done everything possible to set this program up for success. Morrison's voice was calm and reassuring. You have chosen good people and created a solid framework. Now you need to trust in their abilities and your own judgment. Doubt is natural, but do not let it paralyze you. Charlotte took a deep breath and nodded. You are right, Ambassador. I just want this to work so badly. I know, Morrison smiled. That passion is part of what makes you good at this. But remember that perfection is not the goal. Progress is the goal. The night before the human advisors were scheduled to arrive, Charlotte could not sleep. She lay in her quarters staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything that could go wrong. But she also thought about everything that could go right. She thought about Zathrian diplomats learning to navigate cultural differences with confidence. She thought about humans and Zathrians working together as genuine partners. She thought about the moment when the Queen Consort's hand had gone up to strike a guard and how Charlotte's intervention had led to this opportunity. Sometimes, the most important moments in history came from small actions. A hand reaching out, a word spoken at the right time, a decision made in a fraction of a second. Charlotte had stopped a slap, and somehow that had opened a door between two civilizations. Now she just had to make sure that door stayed open, and that both sides walked through it willingly. The Queen Consort walked back to the center of the garden and studied Charlotte with new eyes. There was a shift happening in their relationship, though neither of them had named it yet. What had started as a potential execution was transforming into something else entirely. Charlotte could feel the change in the air like the pressure before a storm. She waited for Velshara to speak, knowing that patience was important in Zathrian culture. I want to propose something, Commander Bennett. The Queen Consort folded her hands in front of her, which was a gesture that meant serious negotiation was about to begin. The Galactic Council Trade Review is important, but it is only the beginning of what we hope to achieve. The Zathrian Empire has the resources and technology to become a major power in the galaxy. What we lack is what you demonstrated today. We lack the ability to adapt to different cultural situations quickly and effectively. Charlotte listened carefully. This was clearly leading somewhere important, and she needed to understand exactly what the Queen Consort was suggesting before she responded. Velshara continued. We have diplomats who are excellent at following protocol and maintaining our traditions. But when confronted with unexpected situations or different cultural frameworks, they struggle. They do not know how to think flexibly the way you did today. The Queen Consort began walking slowly around the garden as she spoke. Charlotte turned to follow her movement but remained standing in place. Our empire has existed for over 8,000 years. We have built a civilization that spans 17 star systems. We have accomplished things that most species can only dream of, but we have done it all while maintaining a rigid social structure and a unified culture. That has been our strength, but it may also become our weakness. Charlotte was beginning to understand where this was going, but she remained quiet. The Queen Consort was working through her thoughts out loud, and interrupting would be rude. Velshara stopped walking and faced Charlotte directly. I want to establish a formal cultural exchange program between the Zathrian Empire and humanity. Not the superficial programs we currently have where diplomats attend banquets and smile at each other. A real program where humans come to train our diplomatic personnel in cultural adaptation and flexible thinking. It was an extraordinary offer. Charlotte felt her mind racing through the implications. This could reshape the entire relationship between their species. But she also knew that such a program would face resistance from both sides. There would be Zathrians who saw it as weakness or corruption of their culture. There would be humans who worried about interfering in alien societies. Your Radiance, this is a significant proposal. Charlotte spoke carefully. May I ask what you envision this program looking like in practice? The Queen Consort seemed pleased by the question. She had expected Charlotte to understand the complexity involved. I envision human advisors working alongside our diplomatic corps. They would not replace our people, but rather teach them new ways of thinking. They would help our diplomats understand how to read situations the way you did today, how to recognize when following traditional protocol might cause problems, and how to adapt without losing our identity. Charlotte nodded slowly. That could work if it was structured properly, but there would need to be clear guidelines about respecting Zathrian sovereignty and culture. The humans involved would need extensive training themselves. They would need to understand that their role was to teach, not to control. Velshara's skin flickered with approval. Exactly. You understand the delicate balance required. This is why I believe you would be the ideal person to lead such a program from the human side. The statement caught Charlotte off guard. She had been thinking about the program in abstract terms, but suddenly it was personal. Your Radiance. I am honored by your confidence, but such a decision would need to be approved by my government. I could not accept such a position without proper authorization. The Queen Consort smiled slightly, which was rare for Zathrians. They did not usually show their teeth when pleased. Of course, I would speak with Ambassador Morrison, and through her with your government. But I want you to know that this proposal comes with my personal endorsement. Charlotte felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. This was bigger than anything she had imagined when she woke up that morning. Your Radiance, may I ask why this matters so much to you personally? You could have simply accepted my explanation about the treaty violation and moved on. Why are you proposing such a major initiative? The Queen Consort was quiet for a moment before answering. Because I am not blind to our limitations, Commander. Velshara's voice was softer now, almost vulnerable. I have traveled to many worlds and met many species. I have seen how they view us. They respect our power and our achievements, but they also see us as rigid and inflexible. They see us as a species that cannot adapt to new situations. In a galaxy that is changing rapidly, that could be fatal. She paused. When you stopped my hand today, you did not just prevent a treaty violation. You showed me something I had been afraid to acknowledge. You showed me that there are things we need to learn from others. Charlotte understood now. This was not just about politics or economics. It was personal for the Queen Consort. Velshara was someone who cared deeply about her empire's future, and she was willing to challenge tradition to ensure that future. That took courage, especially in a culture as bound by custom as the Zathrians. Your Radiance. I believe this program could be beneficial for both our peoples, but it will require careful planning and patience. There will be resistance on both sides, I know. The Queen Consort straightened her shoulders. Which is why I need someone like you to help make it work. Someone who understands both the importance of cultural preservation and the necessity of adaptation. Someone who has already proven they can make difficult decisions under pressure. Will you consider it? Charlotte met her gaze steadily. I will consider it, Your Radiance, and I will recommend it to Ambassador Morrison. But I will need time to think about what such a program would require and whether I am truly the right person to lead it. That is all I ask. Velshara gestured toward the garden entrance. Let us return to the main hall. We have been gone long enough that people will be wondering what we discussed. They will speculate and spread rumors. Charlotte smiled slightly. That is inevitable, Your Radiance, but perhaps some speculation can work in our favor. If people are curious about what we discussed, they may be more open to new ideas when we present them. The Queen Consort's skin flickered with amusement. You learn quickly, Commander. Come. We have much work ahead of us. The transport ship carrying the first group of human advisors arrived at the orbital station above the Zathrian capital, exactly on schedule. Charlotte stood in the docking bay watching through the viewing window as the ship completed its approach. Her stomach was tight with anticipation. These 12 people represented the future of the program, and possibly the future of human-Zathrian relations. No pressure at all, she thought to herself with dark humor. Valkyra stood beside her, also watching the ship dock. The Zathrian director had proven to be an excellent partner over the past weeks. She was organized and thoughtful, and willing to consider ideas that challenged her assumptions. Charlotte had learned to read the subtle color shifts in her skin. Right now, Valkyra was showing a mix of anticipation and nervousness. Apparently, Charlotte was not the only one feeling the pressure. The airlock cycled open and the human advisors began filing through. Charlotte had reviewed their files so many times she recognized each of them immediately. Dr. Helen Brooks was first. She was a cultural anthropologist who had spent 20 years studying first contact protocols. Her gray hair and warm smile made her look like somebody's grandmother, but her mind was sharp as a knife. Behind her came Captain Danny Ford, a former military officer who specialized in cross-cultural communication training. The rest of the group followed in a steady stream. There was Professor Kevin Liu, who taught diplomatic theory at the Academy on Earth, Dr. Nancy Harper, who was their medical specialist, Commander Ryan Scott, who had experience training military personnel for alien contact situations. Each person brought unique skills and perspectives. Charlotte had chosen them not just for their expertise, but for their ability to work in teams and adapt to challenging circumstances. "Welcome to the Zathrian Empire," Charlotte said when they had all assembled in the docking bay. "I'm Director Charlotte Bennett, and this is Director Valkyra. We will be your primary contacts during your time here. I know you are all tired from the journey, but we have a brief orientation scheduled for this afternoon. Tomorrow we begin the real work." The advisors nodded and murmured acknowledgments. They looked eager despite their obvious fatigue. The orientation took place in one of the conference rooms at the Cultural Exchange Initiative headquarters. Charlotte and Valkyra took turns explaining the program structure and expectations. They covered everything from daily schedules to cultural protocols to emergency procedures. The human advisors listened carefully and asked intelligent questions. Charlotte could see them already analyzing the situation and thinking about how to approach their assignments. One of the advisors, named Lisa Chen, raised her hand during the discussion of teaching methods. "Director Bennett, you mentioned that we will be working alongside Zathrian diplomats rather than lecturing them. Can you give us an example of what that looks like in practice?" Charlotte nodded. "Good question. Let me give you a scenario. Imagine a Zathrian diplomat is preparing for negotiations with the Vryn Confederacy. Instead of telling them what to do, you would sit with them and analyze Vryn cultural values together. You would ask questions that help them see patterns they might not notice on their own. You would share how humans might approach the same situation but frame it as one option among many, not the right answer." Lisa nodded thoughtfully. "So we are more like coaches than teachers." "Exactly," Charlotte said. "You are helping them develop new ways of thinking, not telling them what to think." Valkyra added her own perspective. "In Zathrian culture, direct instruction from a superior is expected and valued. But we have learned that for this particular type of skill development, a more collaborative approach is more effective. It will feel strange to both sides at first, but we believe it will produce better results." After the orientation, Charlotte showed the human advisors to their living quarters. The rooms were comfortable and designed to accommodate human needs. Each advisor had their own private space, plus access to common areas where they could gather and relax. Charlotte had made sure there were familiar touches like coffee makers and access to human entertainment and news feeds. Being surrounded by alien culture every day could be exhausting, and people needed places to feel at home. That evening, Charlotte hosted an informal dinner for the new arrivals. It was held in one of the human-style dining rooms with food imported from Earth. She wanted them to have one last meal of familiar food before they started adapting to Zathrian cuisine. As they ate, Charlotte encouraged them to share their first impressions and concerns. Dr. Brooks spoke up first. "I've been studying alien cultures for 2 decades, but being here in person is different than reading reports. The Zathrians are beautiful but also intimidating. Their formality and precision in everything they do. I worry about making mistakes." "You will make mistakes," Charlotte said honestly. "I have made plenty of them myself. The key is to learn from them and not let fear paralyze you. The Zathrians understand that we are different, and they are choosing to work with us anyway. They want this program to succeed as much as we do." Captain Ford added his own thoughts. "I'm more worried about our tendency as humans to be too casual. We use first names and make jokes and touch each other on the shoulder. The Zathrians might see that as disrespectful or unprofessional. That is a valid concern," Charlotte acknowledged. "You will need to be more formal than you are used to, especially at first. But here is something interesting I have learned. The Zathrians are curious about human informality. They see it as connected to our ability to form quick bonds and work flexibly. So while you need to respect their preferences, You should not completely hide who you are. Finding the right balance is part of what you will be teaching them through your example. The conversation continued late into the evening. The advisors asked questions and shared concerns and gradually began to relax into their new situation. Charlotte watched them interact and felt a growing confidence. These were good people. They were smart and adaptable and genuinely committed to the program's success. They would make mistakes and face challenges, but she believed they would rise to meet them. The next morning, the program officially began. Charlotte stood in the main classroom and watched as 12 human advisors met 24 Zathrian diplomats for the first time. The atmosphere was tense. Both groups were sizing each other up, trying to read subtle signals across the species barrier. Charlotte let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking. She addressed both groups in Zathrian first and then in English. Welcome to the first day of something new. We are here because both our peoples recognize that the galaxy is changing, and we need to change with it. You will not always agree. You will not always understand each other. But if you approach this with open minds and genuine respect, something valuable can emerge. She paused and looked around the room, meeting eyes both human and Zathrian. 3 months ago, I stopped a hand from striking a guard. It was a small action in a moment of crisis. But from that moment, this program was born. Now it is up to all of you to make it real. Not by being perfect, but by being willing to try and to learn and to build something together. The room remained quiet, but Charlotte could sense a shift. The tension was still there, but now there was also possibility. That would be enough to start with. Valkyra stepped forward and began outlining the first exercise. It was a relatively simple scenario analysis designed to let both groups see how each approached problems. As the Zathrian and human participants began working together in small mixed groups, Charlotte watched from the side. There were awkward moments and confused looks. There were cultural misunderstandings that had to be clarified, but there was also engagement. People were trying. And trying was the first step toward succeeding. 6 months passed, and the Cultural Exchange Initiative had become a permanent fixture in the Imperial Palace. What had started as an experiment was now an established program with measurable results. The Zathrian diplomats who had gone through the training were showing improved flexibility in negotiations with other species. They were learning to read situations that did not fit traditional protocols and respond appropriately. It was not perfect, but it was progress. Charlotte stood in her office reviewing reports from the Galactic Council. The Zathrian Empire's application for expanded trade rights had been approved 3 weeks earlier. Ambassador Thelkor of the Vryn Confederacy had written in his recommendation that the Empire had demonstrated remarkable commitment to adapting to Council standards. He specifically mentioned the Cultural Exchange Initiative as evidence of the Zathrians' willingness to engage cooperatively with the broader galactic community. The economic impact was already being felt. New trade agreements were being signed. Zathrian companies were expanding into markets that had previously been closed to them. The 17 billion credits that Charlotte had cited in that crucial moment in the hall was becoming reality. But more important than the money was the shift in how other species viewed the Zathrian Empire. They were no longer seen as rigid and inflexible. They were becoming known as a civilization that could adapt while maintaining its identity. Not everything had gone smoothly. There had been conflicts and frustrations along the way. Some Zathrian diplomats resisted the training and questioned why they needed to learn from humans. Some human advisors struggled with the formality and hierarchy of Zathrian culture. There had been misunderstandings that required careful mediation. But Charlotte and Valkyra had worked together to address each problem as it arose. Their partnership had proven to be one of the program's greatest strengths. One of the success stories was young Corval. The guard whose mistake had started everything had thrown himself into the program with dedication that impressed everyone. He had proven to be a quick learner with a natural talent for understanding cultural nuances. His early failure had given him humility and perspective that made him better at his new role. Charlotte had recommended him for a position in the diplomatic corps, and the recommendation had been accepted. He would begin his new assignment next month. Charlotte was in a meeting with Valkyra discussing plans for expanding the program when the Queen Consort arrived unexpectedly. Both directors stood immediately and offered the formal greeting. Valkyra waved for them to sit. "I am here informally. I wanted to see how things were progressing." Charlotte and Valkyra exchanged glances, and then Valkyra spoke. "Your Radiance, the program has exceeded our initial expectations. We have clear evidence of improved diplomatic outcomes among participants. We are receiving requests from other departments asking if we can expand the training to their personnel. The Queen Consort's skin shifted to a pleased blue color. Good. That is very good. She looked at Charlotte directly. Director Bennett, I wanted to thank you personally for your work here. When I proposed this program, I knew it was necessary, but I was not certain it would succeed. You have made it succeed through dedication and skill. Charlotte felt herself flush slightly at the praise. Thank you, Your Radiance. But this success belongs to many people. The human advisors and Zathrian participants have all contributed, and Director Valkyra has been an outstanding partner. Velshara nodded in acknowledgement. I have been thinking about the future. This program has proven that humans and Zathrians can work together effectively. But I wonder if we are thinking too small. What if we expanded this model to include other species? What if the Cultural Exchange Initiative became a center for multi-species diplomatic training? Charlotte felt her mind racing at the implications. That would be extraordinary, Your Radiance. But it would require significant resources and political support, I know. The Queen Consort's eyes gleamed with ambition. But the galaxy needs something like this. Most species develop their diplomatic traditions in isolation. They learn to deal with others through trial and error, often making costly mistakes along the way. A center that brings together knowledge from multiple civilizations could accelerate learning and reduce conflicts. It could become something truly valuable to the entire galactic community. Valkyra's skin flickered with excitement. The Zathrian Empire could host such a center. It would enhance our prestige and give us a central role in shaping galactic diplomacy. Charlotte added her thoughts. And humanity could contribute our experience in cultural adaptation, but we would need participation from other species as well. The Vryn, the Koltari, the Mendari, each would bring their own perspectives and techniques. The three of them talked for over an hour, sketching out possibilities and challenges. It was an ambitious vision, but it was also logical. The current program had proven the concept worked. Expanding it would require diplomatic negotiations with multiple governments and significant funding. But the potential benefits were enormous. A place where young diplomats from across the galaxy could learn from each other, could change the nature of interstellar relations. After the Queen Consort left, Charlotte sat quietly in her office, thinking about how far things had come. 6 months ago, she had been a security commander protecting an ambassador. Now she was directing a program that was reshaping relationships between species. And if this new vision came to pass, she might help create something even bigger, something that could outlast her own lifetime. She thought back to that moment in the hall when everything had changed. The Queen Consort's hand rising to strike a young guard, Charlotte's instant decision to intervene, the shock and anger, and then the conversation that followed. Every choice she had made in those critical seconds had led to this moment. If she had hesitated or chosen differently, none of this would exist. The program, the partnerships, the possibilities for the future, all of it had emerged from a single moment of action. That evening, Charlotte received a message from Ambassador Morrison, who was now back on Earth. The ambassador had been following the program's progress closely and offering advice when asked. Her message was brief but meaningful. Charlotte, you have done something remarkable. You took a crisis and turned it into an opportunity. You built bridges where there were only gaps. Whatever comes next, remember this success and know that you earned it. Charlotte read the message twice and felt a warmth spread through her chest. Recognition from Morrison meant more than any official award. Later that night, Charlotte walked through the corridors of the Cultural Exchange Initiative headquarters. She could hear voices from one of the common rooms where human advisors and Zathrian diplomats were having an informal discussion. She paused outside the door and listened. They were talking about a recent negotiation one of the Zathrians had conducted. The human advisors were asking questions and the Zathrian was explaining his thinking. It was collaborative and respectful. It was exactly what the program was supposed to be. Charlotte continued walking until she reached the garden where she had first spoken privately with the Queen Consort. The plants still glowed softly in the darkness. The city lights twinkled below. Everything looked the same as it had 6 months ago, but everything had changed. The garden was no longer just a beautiful space. It was the place where a new future had been imagined into existence. She thought about all the people who had contributed to making this work. Valkyra, who had been willing to trust a human partner. The Queen Consort, who had the courage to admit her empire needed help. Ambassador Morrison, who had supported the program politically, the human advisors who had left Earth to work in an alien culture, the Zathrian diplomats who had opened themselves to new ways of thinking, and young Corvell, whose mistake had inadvertently created an opportunity. Charlotte knew that challenges still lay ahead. Expanding the program to include other species would be complicated. There would be setbacks and conflicts. There would be people who resisted change and others who wanted to move too fast. But she also knew that something important had been started here. Something that could grow and spread and eventually change how species related to each other across the galaxy. The Queen Consort's hand had gone up to slap a guard, and Charlotte had intervened. From that single moment, a world of possibilities had opened up, and the story was just beginning.